Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old whisper into two places that should never have spoken to one another. A lake moving in darkness beneath Antarctic ice, and a clay tablet sleeping in a museum drawer. Recently, researchers used advanced AI models to compare Sumerian flood tablets, geological scans of the Antarctic bedrock, radar maps of hidden subglacial lakes, and old translations that had been sitting quietly in academic archives for decades. What surfaced was not proof of a lost polar empire, and I want to be careful about that from the first breath, but it was something stranger and somehow more haunting. The patterns matched around one persistent idea. Knowledge can survive the destruction of the world above it if it is hidden in the right place, in the right medium, and if someone on the far side still knows how to read it. If that kind of mystery is your kind of evening, do take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these long, quiet stories going. Then let the room go a little darker. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day move a few steps farther away. We are going down now, gently, not into panic, but into depth, into ice, into clay, into the old calm places where memory waits under pressure. In December of 2018, a drill bit descended through more than a kilometer of Antarctic ice and entered something the surface world almost never gets to touch. Lake Mercer, a body of fresh water sealed in darkness below the ice, hidden from sunlight for more than 100,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Water still moving, still carrying currents, still holding life, while above it entire empires rose and fell without ever knowing it was there. The ice above was not dead. It was weight. It was cover. It was a vault door built by climate and time. Now move 6,000 miles north in the imagination, away from that frozen black water, into a quiet museum room where the air is dry and filtered and cool. A curator slides open a shallow drawer. Inside lies an old clay tablet, the color of dust and faint fire, wrapped carefully, resting with that peculiar dignity ancient objects have when they know they have already outlived everyone who first touched them. When translation software trained on thousands of cuneiform signs was turned loose on tablets like this, and then checked by human Assyriologists line by line, something emerged that old scholarship had noticed in fragments but never gathered with this much force. The texts keep circling the same idea. There is knowledge from before the flood. There are waters beneath the world. There are beings, or councils, or teachers, who preserve systems through catastrophe. The source script we are following tonight pairs those two archives, the hidden Antarctic water and the hidden Mesopotamian text. And, honestly, I have always found that pairing unnerving in a quiet way. Not because it proves some wild television theory with dramatic music and a suspicious number of glowing blue graphics. It does not. It is stranger than that. It invites us to think about preservation itself, about what survives when the visible world changes too fast for memory to keep pace. Researchers did not use AI here as a magic oracle. They used it like a patient machine assistant with a terrifying appetite for patterns. They fed it radar maps of subglacial hydrology, translated lines from Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, geological timelines for Antarctic glaciation, and annotated records from archaeologists. paleoclimate scientists, and museum collections. The models did what they do best. They lined things up. They flagged repeated structures. They showed where the same image appeared in different forms. Hidden water, knowledge beneath the surface. Systems preserved through destruction. Survival through correct medium. That last point is the quiet center of the whole script. If catastrophe is coming, what do you choose to preserve? And how do you preserve it so that the disaster itself does not destroy the message? The Sumerians chose clay. Wet clay impressed with a reed stylus, dried, and sometimes fired hard by kiln or by the very city fires that ended the civilization that wrote it. The Antarctic continent chose ice, or rather nature chose it. Snow fell. Snow compacted, pressure built. Water was sealed below. Ancient air was trapped in bubbles. The archive closed itself. One archive intentional, one accidental, both patient. This is why the opening image matters so much. A drill bit reaches black water in Antarctica. A drawer opens on a brown tablet in a museum. One archive hidden by cold, one by time. Both beneath a surface. Both still legible, if you have the tools. The source begins with a tablet identified as a British museum piece from around 1800 before Christ. It speaks of waters beneath the world, the Abzu, the realm of Enki, lord of fresh water under the earth, keeper of the hidden source from which rivers and springs rise. To a casual reader, this sounds mythic immediately. Of course it does. A god in subterranean waters, beneath the visible world, holding wisdom in darkness. But then the text keeps doing something subtle. It describes the realm almost physically. Depth, coolness, darkness, movement of fresh water below. Not the sea, not abstract heavenly mist. Fresh water below ground. And here the AI comparison becomes interesting. Geological data from Antarctica describes subglacial lakes exactly as real. Physical systems. Hidden. Dark. Fresh. Pressurized. Still moving beneath impossible weight. No, the Sumerians did not know Antarctica existed. That would be a ridiculous claim. And the source itself is careful not to make it as proof. But the conceptual parallel is sharp. A hidden watery realm beneath the surface. Life and memory preserved there. Access possible only through specialized knowledge and deliberate technique. Lake Vostok. Lake Mercer. More than 400 subglacial lakes mapped under Antarctic ice. Fresh water and darkness beneath a frozen world. Pressure and geothermal warmth keeping parts of that hidden hydrology alive. When scientists sample those lakes, they find organisms, genetic traces, stubborn forms of life lingering in the sealed dark. That alone should be enough to make anyone lower their voice a little. Now let your mind drift back to Mesopotamia, to Eridu, Marsh Edge City, first city in the memory of the king list, the place where fresh water rose from below and mixed with the uncertain boundary of land and reed and sea. The Sumerians placed Enki there, not on a mountain, not in the blazing open sky, in the cool hidden source beneath the ground. The temple of Eridu was tied to the Abzu. The hidden became visible there. The underground system came close enough to the surface to be honored. If you were standing there with me in imagination, the land would feel unstable in a calm way. Marsh breath, soft mood, reeds whispering, fresh water pushing up from below while salt marsh and tidal wetness linger nearby. A place where the earth itself seems to admit that there are systems below the visible world that rule everything above it. This is where the script asks its first serious question. What if the old texts are not trying to explain where everything began? What if they are trying to explain what was preserved from before? That is not quite the same thing, and the difference matters. Modern people tend to ask beginnings questions. Where did civilization start? Who invented writing? How did kingship first emerge? The Sumerian texts often sound as though they are asking another question. What descended? What was handed down? What survived the break? That is why the source leans so hard on phrases like inherited, not invented, and received, not discovered. The AI models highlighted that pattern across the translations. Again and again, the language of early civilization is not framed as brilliant human invention appearing from nowhere. It is framed as transfer, decree, assignment, transmission. And that brings us to the Anunnaki, though only gently for now. The source says the Anunnaki appear in the tablets not primarily as cartoonish creators with lightning in their sleeves, but as teachers, judges, decision-makers, administrators of systems, beings attached to the work of preserving order and transmitting what came before the flood into the world after it. That does not prove what they literally were. The script leaves room there. Gods. Symbolic memory. A lost knowledge-bearing class. Something more difficult to classify. But their function is clear. They carry continuity. This is exactly the kind of thing AI is oddly good at helping us see. Human readers notice images. Scholars notice philological details. Geologists notice timelines. Archaeologists notice material context. AI can take the translated corpus, the geological record, the preserved hydrology, and the repeated descriptive structures, then say, this cluster belongs together. Hidden waters, catastrophe, preservation, reimplementation. The pattern is not random. Now, before this starts sounding too certain, let us slow down and be fair. Parallel is not proof. Similarity is not identity. The source itself says so. Antarctica is not being offered as a confirmed homeland of the Anunnaki. The value of the comparison is conceptual. Both archives preserve what came before a transformation so severe that the surface world afterward could barely reconstruct it without help. One archive stores ancient atmosphere in ice bubbles. The other stores ancient memory in wedge-shaped marks. One is red with drills, isotope analysis, and DNA sequencing. The other with dictionaries, neural translation systems, human scholarship, and years of grammatical care. Both require specialists. Both resist casual reading. Both say, very softly, that the world above is never the whole story. I think that is why this opening works so well as a sleep story. It is not asking you to believe one dramatic, impossible thing. It is asking you to dwell in a quieter truth. Surfaces mislead. Archives wait below. What appears lost may only be buried in the wrong medium for ordinary memory to reach. The Sumerians knew something about that. They pressed words into clay because clay could survive when papyrus would rot and wood would burn and speech would vanish into the air. Antarctica knows something about it too. In the indifferent way continents know things. Ice keeps records because cold is merciless and exact. Air bubbles from 800,000 years ago remain intact because the archive never opened. Ancient valley systems under East Antarctica remain readable in radar because the ice did not destroy them. It sealed them. And that is the word that begins to echo now. Sealed. The lake sealed under ice. The tablet sealed in a drawer. The hidden waters of the Abzu sealed under earth. Knowledge sealed against forgetting, if encoded correctly. Soon we will move toward the king list and its strange phrase about kingship descending from heaven, and then into the old flood texts, where warnings are whispered through reed walls and boats are built by procedure. Not be panic. But before any of that, we need to stand a little longer at the threshold between the two archives. Cold under ice. Dust under museum light. Both holding what came before. Both forcing us to admit that preservation may be the oldest secret civilization ever learned. If the first movement of this mystery belongs to hidden archives, then the second belongs to hidden water. Not poetic water. Not the easy kind that glitters in sunlight and makes everyone in documentaries say the word sacred in a slightly overcommitted whisper. I mean real hidden water. Cold, dark, physically present beneath the surface. Moving according to rules the people above can only infer from springs, wells, marshes, and the stubborn fact that life keeps appearing where there should not be enough visible water to sustain it. The Sumerian word is Abzu, sometimes rendered Apsu in later Akkadian usage. The deep fresh water beneath the earth, not the sea, not the open ocean, not the salt world. Fresh water below, concealed, feeding the visible world from underneath. In the oldest readable layers of Mesopotamian thought, this is not treated as a decorative metaphor. It is a place, or at least a model of a place, a hidden source realm. When the newest translation systems were applied to old passages about Enki and the Abzu, researchers noticed how often physical description rises to the surface of the language. Enki is associated with coolness, darkness, depth, stillness, underground origin, hidden channels, springs. He is not simply wise in a vague priestly way. He knows how things work beneath appearances. He is linked to crafts, technical skill, building, writing, order, clever solutions, indirect warnings, and all the procedural habits that keep a fragile world functioning. That combination matters. Hidden water below. Hidden knowledge below. One God tied to both. Now lay that next to Antarctica. Scientists have spent decades mapping the buried hydrology under Antarctic ice. Not guessing, not fantasizing, but measuring. Ice-penetrating radar, satellite altimetry, drill cores, thermal models, hydrological flow maps. Under the ice, there are lakes. More than 400 of them have been identified. Some isolated. Some connected by subglacial channels. Fresh water held in darkness under immense pressure. In places where the surface temperature would kill ordinary assumptions before breakfast. Lake Vostok is the giant in the room. A body of water the size of a great inland lake, sealed beneath roughly 4 kilometers of ice. Dark for millions of years. Fresh water maintained by pressure and geothermal heat. Then there is Lake Mercer. Smaller, younger in its isolation, but still astonishing, still hidden, still alive enough to yield microbial and biological traces when sampled. The source script places these Antarctic discoveries beside the Abzu, and here again we must be careful. Parallel, not proof, but it is a powerful parallel all the same. Because the Sumerians built a cosmological model around something they genuinely observed. Water rises from below. Wells fill. Springs emerge. Marshes breathe with unseen supply. River systems remain fed even when surface rain is absent. Their explanation, without modern geology, was that fresh water exists beneath the world in a vast hidden domain. That is not primitive foolishness. That is pattern recognition with the tools they had. The AI angle sharpens this beautifully. Researchers used language models trained on Sumerian and Akkadian lexical corpora, then compared the semantic cluster around Abzu with modern hydrological terminology and geological description. Human scholars still did the real interpretive work. Of course, but the machine flagged something important. The old texts were more physically grounded than many popular retellings suggest. The Abzu is not merely a dream place. It behaves like an ancient theory of hidden water systems beneath the visible landscape. And once you start reading the old lines that way, Enki changes too. He is no longer just a water god in the simplified textbook sense. He becomes keeper of hidden infrastructure, lord of what sustains surface order from below, guardian of the unseen source, patron of the arts that make civilization possible, because civilization itself depends on understanding hidden systems. Irrigation, measurement, craft, writing, timing, thresholds, procedures. The source keeps returning to that word, and it is not hard to see why. Procedure is memory made durable. If you think about it, that is exactly what all stable worlds require. Surface beauty is not enough. There must be channels below, plans below, routines below, quiet knowledge below. A city survives because invisible systems keep it alive. Water lines, grain accounting, ritual order, seasonal timing, storage practice, administrative memory. The Sumerians wrapped all of that into divine language, and Enki became the face of hidden competence. Honestly, I have always liked Enki for that reason. He feels like the god of knowing where the valve is when everyone else is still arguing about the flood. The texts describe him as cunning, practical, often indirect. He does not always oppose catastrophe openly, but he repeatedly finds a way to preserve continuity through it. He warns through a wall instead of breaking an oath directly. He teaches by transmission. He passes on systems rather than striking heroic poses. If the source is right in its emphasis, then Enki is not just wise. He is archival. He is what continuity looks like when the world above is becoming unreliable. Now, bring Antarctica back into view. When scientists study Antarctic ice cores, they are not merely measuring frozen water. They are reading an archive. Layers of snowfall compacted through time, bubbles of ancient atmosphere trapped and sealed, isotopic ratios recording temperature, ash recording volcanic events, dust carrying evidence of remote processes. The archive remains legible because the medium is stable. Cold, pressure, darkness, and protection from disturbance do the work of preservation. Subglacial lakes add another layer to that archive. They preserve not just atmospheric memory in ice, but biological and hydrological memory in hidden liquid systems. Organisms sealed off from the surface persist. Slowly, stubbornly. Genetic information remains readable. Conditions from before surface change remain encoded below. That is a sentence I think the entire source script wants us to feel rather than merely understand. Conditions from before surface change remain encoded below. The Abzu serves the same role symbolically in the Mesopotamian record. It is where foundational knowledge is stored beneath the visible world. It is not merely where water comes from. It is where principles come from. The source mentions the me, the organizing powers or decrees of civilization, and that matters here. In later myths, these powers are distributed, guarded, transferred, sometimes stolen, but always treated as prior to ordinary human improvisation. Civilization is not a spontaneous party. It is access to an older order. Now, to be fair again, there are several ways scholars can read this. One could say the Sumerians simply projected institutional authority into divine space. That is a reasonable reading. Another could say they preserved dim memory of real processes of transmission. Agricultural, technical, administrative, through mythic language. Also reasonable. The source plays nearest to that second possibility, and then stretches it outward with the Antarctic comparison. Not claiming certainty, inviting a pattern. That is where AI enters not as prophet, but as pattern finder. It can compare texts about hidden fresh water, warning systems, post-catastrophe restoration, preservation media, and subglacial archive science. Then show how the same conceptual skeleton appears again and again. Beneath the world lies a hidden reservoir. Knowledge from before catastrophe is stored there. Access requires specialist methods. What survives depends on medium. That last phrase keeps knocking gently at the door. What survives depends on medium. Clay survived because fire hardened it. Ice survives because cold seals it. DNA survives because chemistry stores it redundantly enough to persist under the right conditions. Temple libraries survived because some cities burned in just the right way to bake their records instead of erasing them completely. Antarctic valleys survived because the freeze sealed the landscape rather than grinding every shape into oblivion at once. Preservation is not luck alone. It is physics meeting circumstance. The source calls Antarctica and Mesopotamian tablets two systems of preservation. one intentional, one accidental. That is one of the smartest lines in the whole script. The Sumerians knew catastrophe would come. Flood, fire, conquest, burial. They chose clay. Antarctica did not choose anything. Climate sealed a continent. Yet the result in both cases is the same. Memory crosses a break because the medium outlives the surface world. And this makes the flood tradition begin to look different before we have even entered it fully. A flood is not only destruction, it is also a filter. What is not protected vanishes. What is encoded properly survives. In that sense, every archive is a kind of ark. Let that thought settle slowly. Every archive is a kind of ark. A museum drawer. A temple foundation deposit. A sealed library room under rubble. An ice core pulled from deep Antarctic strata. A lake under kilometers of ice. A clay tablet hardened by the same urban fire that killed the city around it. All of them carrying selected continuity through a world-changing event. This is why the script turns toward the Sumerian king list so naturally after dwelling on the Abzu. Once hidden water and hidden memory have been established. The next step is organized rule. Kingship itself is described as descending, not emerging. The institution arrives as if from elsewhere. That phrase sounds much less absurd once you have spent time in the Abzu. Of course, it descends. Everything important in these texts seems to come from below or above or before, but rarely from the ordinary present moment. And this is also why Eridu matters so much. The city stands at the threshold where hidden water meets surface life. The first city in the king list. The city of Enki. The place where the underground source becomes available to a settlement. That is not just a geographic detail. It is almost a thesis. Civilization begins where hidden systems can be tapped and managed. If you were there in the old marsh country, the air would feel thick and mineral and alive. Reeds brushing one another. Mud cooling after heat. Pools reflecting a thin sky. Fresh water appearing in a place where without it, nothing organized could last for long. A temple above that threshold. Priests and workers and scribes all building their visible order above an invisible source. It is hard to imagine a better symbolic center for a civilization obsessed with inherited knowledge and hidden foundations. Soon the source will move toward the king list. The impossible reigns, and the flood that interrupts them. But before that, the Abzu leaves us with one essential lesson. The most important systems may be the ones no one on the surface can see directly. Water beneath the ground. Memory beneath the myth. Knowledge beneath the institution. Archive beneath catastrophe. And once that lesson has been learned, the descent of kingship no longer sounds like pure fantasy. It sounds like the next layer of the same old logic. Order comes from a hidden source. Someone preserves it. Someone transmits it. Someone above ground receives it and calls that reception the beginning. The next thing the researchers fed into the translation models was not a myth in the usual sense, not a soaring poem of gods throwing stars into place, but something colder, more orderly, and for that very reason, much stranger. A list. A clay prism in Oxford. four-sided, covered in tiny wedge marks that march down the surface with the patience of accounting. The kind of object a distracted visitor might walk past because it looks administrative. And administration is rarely glamorous until you notice that this particular administration begins with a sentence that should not exist. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. When the newest translation systems compared that line against older English renderings, German scholarship, French commentaries, transliteration databases, and sign-by-sign lexical tables, the result did not become less strange. It became more exact. The grammar really does point to descent, not invention, not gradual social development, not an energetic town meeting at the dawn of urban life. Descent, transfer, arrival from above to below. That matters because the line is not talking about a single king. It is talking about kingship itself, the office, the system, the structure of rule, the institution that lets a city become more than a collection of houses near useful water. The Sumerian term points to the function of kingship, not merely the personality of a ruler. And once the AI models flagged the consistency of that usage across related texts, researchers began emphasizing something the source script wants us to feel very clearly. The tablet is treating rule as a technology that can be transmitted. I have always found that detail deeply unnerving in the most elegant way. It suggests that the first city did not invent its form of order from scratch. It received it, which means civilization, at least in its own memory, was taught. Now, the object carrying this claim is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, preserved in Oxford, a reddish-brown prism inscribed around 1800 before Christ, though the material it records was understood by its scribes to be vastly older. AI helped here too, not by replacing the Assyriologists, but by doing what patient machines do best. It cross-checked the variant copies of the king list from different sites, aligned signs, highlighted recurrent formulae, flagged mathematical patterns in reign lengths, and showed that the anti-flood section and the later historical section are written in the same calm administrative register. That last part matters more than most people realize. Because the list does not suddenly put on theatrical costume when it reaches the impossible kings. It simply begins. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Then kingship moved to Bad Tabira. Then more rulers, more immense spans, more cities, more impossible duration, all recorded with the same tidy seriousness later used for kings, whose historical existence is supported by archaeology and inscription. The scribal voice does not wink. It does not say this next part is symbolic. It does not give us a polite museum label saying myth starts here. The list treats the whole sequence as record. That is one reason scholars have been arguing with this object for so long. The mainstream interpretation is clear enough. The anti-flood kings are symbolic. Their numbers are numerological. Their reigns belong to sacred time, not ordinary time. The later kings belong to history. Fine. That position has weight, but the source script leans into the discomfort that remains after that explanation. Why this format? Why these exact formulas? Why preserve impossible numbers with bureaucratic precision across multiple manuscript traditions if they were merely decorative? The AI comparison work made that tension more visible, because it showed just how stable the structure remains from version to version. The long reigns are not random noise. They follow patterns. They are often multiples of large numerical units meaningful in Mesopotamian mathematics. The names themselves are linguistically coherent. The sequence of cities matters. This is not a pile of fantasy fragments. It is an organized memory system, even if we do not fully understand the units in which that memory was encoded. Some researchers still wonder whether those great spans refer not to single biological lifetimes, but to dynasties, lineages, epochs, or institutional durations later copied as years. That remains debated. The source script wisely leaves it open. But whatever the numbers originally meant, the scribes considered them too important to discard. The AI models, set loose on internal repetition and mathematical clustering, reinforced that impression. The anti-flood section behaves like preserved legacy data, precise enough to be copied carefully, old enough that its exact meaning may already have been obscure to some of the people copying it. That image is worth lingering with. A scribe in the old Babylonian period sits in filtered light with earlier source material before him, perhaps damaged, perhaps copied from something older, perhaps already partially archaic in language and number. He does not fully modernize it. He preserves it. The machine intelligence used by researchers today notices the same thing human scholars have long suspected. Exact copying can outlast exact understanding. That is how archives become eerie. The prism names 5 pre-flood cities. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Ladak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. The sequence matters because it is not simply listing rulers. It is moving kingship itself from city to city, as though authority were a thing that can reside somewhere, then depart, then take up residence elsewhere. That is a very unusual way to speak, unless you already think of civilization as governed by transferable systems, by offices, decrees, and bodies of knowledge that exist apart from any one human being. And once again, the AI angle does not cheapen that strangeness. It sharpens it. By comparing the Sumerian phrases for kingship, descent, city transfer, and divine allocation across the king list and related texts, the models helped scholars see that Mesopotamian thought repeatedly speaks of order as something assigned and redistributed. Rule is portable. The me are portable. Skills are portable. Temple authority is portable. Knowledge belongs first to those who guard it, then to those who receive it correctly. That is the hidden skeleton under this whole part of the story. The source wants us to hear the sentence after kingship descended from heaven, not as a bit of picturesque mythology, but as a memory of transmission. Someone already had the system. Someone brought it. Someone implemented it in Eridu. Whether those someones were gods in the devotional sense, elite teachers, priestly archivists, a remembered older civilization, or a symbolic compression of all of the above remains unresolved. The text itself does not clarify the mechanism. It records the transfer. And there is something almost chilling in that restraint. The list does not explain. It assumes. Eridu itself makes the line even stranger, because the city is real. The archaeological site exists. Temples there reach back into the Ubaid period, making Eridu one of the oldest urban religious centers in Mesopotamia. When the AI-based analysis cross-referenced the textual claim with archaeological reports, the result did not make the line simpler. It made it denser. Eridu really is old enough to sit plausibly at the edge of remembered beginnings. Fresh water emerged there. The temple stood over the threshold between the hidden and the visible. If any place in Sumerian memory would receive descended kingship, it would be that marsh-edge city where the Abzu seemed closest to the surface. Now let your mind picture the atmosphere of the first entries in the list. No dramatic thunder. No chorus. Just clay. Columns. Names. Numbers so large they become almost quiet in the mind. Alulim. Alalgur. Then transfer. Then more names. The rhythm of administration moving through impossible time. If you were holding the prism in low light, you might feel the odd sensation that the text is not trying to convince you. It is reporting from a world in which this all made structural sense. I think that is part of what makes the King List so effective as a dark sleep story. It does not frighten by shouting. It unsettles by being organized. The same mind that can count barley, lavor, and offerings can also calmly tell you that the first kings ruled for spans longer than later civilizations could imagine, and that all of it belongs to the same chain of record. And then, just when the impossible order has settled into place, the text gives you the break. The flood swept over. That line is still ahead of us in full force, but you can already feel it approaching here. The list is not merely laying out a strange old golden age. It is building toward interruption, toward the point where the first continuity fails, where kingship itself must descend again because whatever held it the first time has been damaged or drowned or broken beyond direct inheritance. Before we cross that threshold, though, stay a little longer with the first descent. A system arrives from heaven. It is placed in Eridu. It moves through cities. It is preserved in exact administrative format, even when its earliest durations cease to be biologically plausible. It survives into later scribal culture because preservation itself is sacred duty. Modern AI compares copies, highlights the stable formulas, and gives the old problem back to us with fresh clarity. The ancients were not careless here. They were transmitting something they believed mattered. The question is not whether the prism is real. It is in the museum. The question is what sort of memory the prism is holding. That question grows heavier now because the next line in the chain is water. Not hidden water this time, but sweeping water. Not sealed archive, but catastrophic interruption. And once that interruption comes, every word about descent, preservation, and resumption begins to sound less like theology and more like an emergency manual for continuity after the world breaks. The flood in these old Mesopotamian texts does not behave like a decorative mythic backdrop. It behaves like an institutional wound. That may be the most important thing the AI-assisted comparisons pulled into view when researchers lined up the king list. The Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, later Akkadian versions, excavation reports, and environmental data from the river valleys. The flood is not just a story event. It is a break in transmission. That is why the phrase after the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, feels so chilling once you notice it. Not because it sounds supernatural in the usual dramatic way, but because it sounds procedural. The system had to be reintroduced. The continuity had failed. Whatever carried organized rule before the catastrophe could not simply be assumed afterward. It had to descend again. There is something almost office-like in the horror of that. Imagine a civilization old enough to know that after enough water, memory does not continue by itself. A city can survive an outline. A temple platform can remain. Fields can still exist. Some seed can be saved. Some specialists can endure. But the chain of exact transmission, the easy confidence that things will continue because they have always continued, that can snap in a single season of rising water and long mud. The source script lingers on flood layers in Mesopotamia for a reason. Archaeology has found them. Not one neat global stratum spread uniformly across every site at the same moment. Reality is less theatrical and more unsettling than that. Different feud deposits appear at different cities, in different thicknesses, at different dates, though some major inundation episodes stand out sharply. Kish, Shurupak, Lagash. Water-laid sediment interrupting occupation. Layers of silt separating one urban life from another. The AI contribution here came through synthesis. Human archaeologists excavated the sites. Geologists dated and described the deposits. Assyriologists handled the texts. Climate historians modeled water movement in the ancient floodplains. Then the models cross-referenced timing, vocabulary, and narrative structure, not to force a single event where none exists, but to show the repeated pattern. Flood in Mesopotamia was real, recurrent, culturally formative, and destructive in exactly the way the preservation stories imply. It broke systems. That is different from merely damaging buildings. A flood in a river valley civilization attacks the invisible framework first. Archives soften. Clay records dissolve if unfired. Levees fail. Water course change. Boundaries blur. Storage collapses. Livestock scatter or drown. Roads vanish into mud. Shrines survive in part, but access routes do not. Even if people live, procedure dies unless someone deliberately carries it forward. That last phrase could almost serve as the subtitle of the entire source. Procedure dies unless someone deliberately carries it forward. And that is exactly what the flood survivors in Mesopotamian literature are asked to do. Take Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis. The tablet is damaged. Yes, but enough survives to show the shape of the event. The gods debate catastrophe. Enki opposes the total destruction of humanity, or at least opposes it enough to preserve continuity. Bound by oath, he does not speak directly. He speaks through a reed wall. The warning comes sideways, as preserved knowledge often does. Indirectly, quietly, procedurally. Build the boat. Prepare correctly. Preserve life. Carry forward what matters. The AI translation work becomes especially useful here because these texts are damaged and layered with centuries of scholarship. Models comparing sign patterns, duplicate phrasing in parallel texts, and the terminology of construction and measurement helped researchers see just how technical the surviving instructions often are. These are not dream symbols floating free of practical thought. Boat dimensions, roofing, equal measures, compartments, preservation priorities. The language behaves like a manual hidden inside a myth. And then there is Atrahasis, where the pattern becomes even clearer. The source script spends time on the labor problem that begins that text, and rightly so. Before the flood, the gods themselves labor. The lower divine workers grow exhausted digging canals and maintaining the infrastructure of civilization. They rebel. The higher divine council responds by creating humanity as a labor solution. Again, not a poetic creation from void, but an administrative response to burden. That tone matters. It means the flood later in the narrative is not random divine mood. It is policy. That sounds almost absurd until you sit with the text. Then it becomes merely cold. Humanity multiplies. Noise grows. The system becomes unstable. Enlil escalates through plague, drought, and finally, flood. Enki keeps finding ways to preserve continuity. The final solution is not to prevent catastrophe entirely, but to transmit correct procedure to one faithful human through an indirect channel. Then trust that preservation work can outlast destruction. The boat itself is described in a way engineers have found disturbingly functional. The source notes this because it matters. The vessel is not a pretty symbolic crescent or a vague floating box. It is measured. Compartments are specified. Waterproofing materials are counted. Dimensions are given in repeated units. The cargo sequence is rational. Family, animals, craftsmen, supplies, seed. That sequence makes sense if the goal is not merely surviving a storm, but restarting civilization after it. I always think that is where the emotional force of these stories lies. The Ark is not only a refuge, it is a memory capsule, a floating archive, a survival barge for technique, shill, reproduction, and ritual continuity. Once the AI models were turned toward procedural language in these texts, that became even harder to miss. The flood stories preserve categories of what must survive. Biological continuity, technical continuity, institutional continuity, religious continuity. The survivor is not only a lucky man, he is a preservation specialist. That is why the reward language after the flood matters too. Ziusudra is preserved because he preserved. Atrahasis survives because he followed procedure exactly. This is not random blessing. It is continuity recognizing continuity. Now set that beside the king list once more. Before the flood, impossible rains and antediluvian cities. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship descends again. If you read that after spending time in the flood narratives, it ceases to sound like a simple, mythic reset. It begins to sound like the re-implementation of archived systems after catastrophic failure. The original chain broke. Enough was saved. The institution could be restored, but only through transmission from those who preserved it. That is the real dark elegance of the source script. It does not ask us to believe that a single global flood drowned the world in the most literal sense. It asks us to consider that repeated catastrophic inundation in Mesopotamia created a cultural memory so powerful that civilization began dividing its own timeline into before the flood and after the flood. That is historically much more plausible, and in some ways more chilling. Not one impossible disaster, but enough real ones to make preservation the core obsession of an entire civilization. The flood layers at Shuruppak are especially useful here because the city itself appears in the tradition as the last of the pre-flood centers. Excavation revealed significant water-laid sediment there, enough to interrupt occupation and then allow resettlement above. The city continues, but across a break. That pattern is exactly what the texts keep describing. Catastrophe. Pause. Survival. Reoccupation. Continuity through disruption. Not continuity without disruption. You know that feeling when a family business burns down and later generations reopen it in the same town with the same name. Same old ledger, if they are lucky. Same rituals, if possible. Same story about how grandfather did things. But everyone quietly knows something irretrievable was lost in the fire. That is the flood mood of Mesopotamia. Restoration is possible. Original continuity is not. And the medium matters again here. Clay survives if properly treated, or if burned at the right time. Ice survives if cold remains. Knowledge survives only if carried in something the catastrophe cannot easily erase. The flood narratives know this. They are obsessed with selection. What to take aboard. What to preserve. Which categories matter. What cannot be left to chance? That is not mythic decoration. That is systems thinking under stress. When researchers used AI to compare the flood narratives with known principles of disaster preservation, the overlap was striking. No, the texts are not modern emergency management manuals, but they encode similar logic. Advance warning, restricted communication, construction specifications, cargo prioritization, sealed shelter, waiting out duration, testing post-event conditions, restoring ritual and agricultural continuity. It is all there, softened by divine language, but structured like preservation doctrine. This is why the source keeps returning to the idea that the tablets are teaching us their own survival method, even by existing. They were written in clay because clay can cross catastrophe. They tell stories about crossing catastrophe through correct medium and procedure. Then they themselves cross fire, burial, collapse, conquest, language, death, and museum storage to reach us. The archive proves the principle it describes. I think that is one of the loveliest and most eerie details in the whole script. The message survives because the message is about survival. And so by the time we reach the flood in the sequence of the long video, the listener should not feel as though a random storm has arrived to add drama. The flood is the hinge. It is where hidden water becomes destructive water. It is where descent must be repeated. It is where pre-flood knowledge becomes post-flood inheritance. It is where the old archive is tested and where the figures who preserve continuity begin to matter more than any individual king. Those figures, of course, include Enki, but they also gather into a larger collective shape. The Anunnaki, assembly beings, decision makers, judges, witnesses, carriers of what the world after the flood can no longer generate easily on its own. The next movement will have to sit with them carefully, because whatever else they are in these texts, they are bound to continuity. They are present before the break, during the decision, and after the restoration. They are the committee that survives the disaster, the archive with a voice, the memory that does not drown. By the time we reach the flood accounts themselves, the atmosphere of the whole story changes. Up to this point, we have been standing in the archive room, looking at patterns, hidden waters, impossible rains, and that unnerving phrase about kingship descending from heaven. But now, the old tablets stop speaking in broad, structural terms and begin speaking in instructions. That shift matters. It is one thing to say catastrophe came. It is another to say what someone was told to do before it arrived. Recently, researchers used advanced AI translation systems to compare damaged flood tablets from Nippur, Sippar, Nineveh, and later Babylonian copies, line by line, checking broken phrases against duplicate formulas and reconstructing repeated procedural language that older translators often treated as merely literary. What surfaced was not a romantic tale of survival by luck. It was a preservation protocol dressed in sacred narrative. That phrase may sound modern, but the texts themselves invite it. Take the Eridu Genesis, the broken and precious tablet often referred to by its museum designation in scholarship. Though for a sleep story, it is gentler to let the number soften into speech and simply think of it as the old Nippur flood tablet. The clay is fragmentary. Parts are gone. The beginning is missing. The end is torn away. But enough survives to reveal the shape of the event. And enough related material survives elsewhere for the AI systems to compare recurring sequences and expose the structure beneath the damage. The world in that text is already organized. Cities exist. Kingship has already descended. Human beings are not standing at the dawn of everything. They are living inside an arrangement that can be disrupted. That matters deeply, because the flood does not arrive as creation in reverse. It arrives as interruption, a policy, a decision, a debated act within a council. That council mood is one of the coldest features of all these texts. The gods do not always move in thunderous unity. They argue. They disagree. They debate how to solve a problem. Humanity in these accounts has become numerous, noisy, difficult, burdensome in ways the divine administrators no longer wish to tolerate. Enlil, often the most severe voice in these matters, is associated with the decision to reduce or sweep away. Enki, just as consistently, becomes the loophole finder, the preserver, the one who cannot fully stop catastrophe but refuses to let continuity vanish with it. That is why the warning comes sideways. The old flood tablet describes Enki speaking not directly to the chosen survivor. but to a reed wall. Reed wall. Red wall. Hear my words. The line is one of the strangest in all ancient literature, and AI comparison only sharpened that strangeness by confirming how consistently indirect transmission appears in these traditions. The source script emphasizes this with good reason. Enki has sworn not to reveal the divine decision openly. He keeps the letter of the oath while defeating its spirit. He speaks to the wall knowing the human stands on the other side. I have always loved that detail more than any thunderbolt. It is so procedural, so cunning, so bureaucratically disobedient. Enki does not overturn heaven with rebellion. He exploits a technicality. That feels exactly right for a god of hidden systems and practical knowledge. Now imagine the scene slowly. Night near the reeds. A house made partly of woven stalk and mud. Air heavy with dampness. The kind of silence that comes before wind changes. On one side of the wall, a human who has spent enough years serving temple order to know that certain tones in the dark should not be ignored. On the other, a divine voice technically addressing architecture. The wall hears. The man hears. The warning enters the world without officially entering it. And what is the warning? Build. Measure. Prepare. The text is damaged. Yes. But the surviving lines and the later parallel versions make the practical core unmistakable. A boat must be made. It must be made correctly. Its dimensions must be equal or carefully proportioned. It must be sealed. It must preserve life through what is coming. This is not vague inspiration. It is pre-catastrophe engineering. When researchers used AI to compare the flood instructions in the old Sumerian material with the later and fuller Akkadian versions, especially the forms preserved in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, they found a remarkable stability in the procedural skeleton. The vessel is enclosed. It is carefully measured. It is protected with bitumen or its equivalent. It contient division. It is meant not to travel elegantly, but to endure. That difference is essential. The ark in these stories is not a ship in the noble exploratory sense. It is an archive with walls, a survival container, a moving vault for continuity. You can feel that in the loading priorities too. The old texts, even when damaged, keep circling the same categories: family, seed, animals, skilled people, provision. In other words, reproduction, biodiversity, craft knowledge, and duration. The AI pattern recognition work was especially useful here because it highlighted that these categories recur not just as symbolic pairings, but as practical preservation classes. What must survive if the world after the flood is to function at all? Not just breathing bodies. Systems. That is what makes the survivor figure so different from a simple hero. Ziusudra, or in later Akkadian forms Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on the tradition, is not selected primarily for battlefield valor or theatrical virtue. He is selected because he can receive instruction and maintain procedure. The source script emphasizes that in the Eridu Genesis, he is described as a keeper of divine ordinances, a guardian of correct practice. That is exactly the kind of person you would choose if what mattered was continuity rather than drama. The flood then comes, not as a moral metaphor first, but as physical force. 7 days and 7 nights. That detail is one of the most stable across the Mesopotamian flood tradition. The storm duration is not 40 days in the later biblical form. It is 7. Wind and water together. Violence enough to erase cult centers from sight. Darkness thick enough to remove orientation. The source script notes that some of this sounds almost meteorological, and I think that is right. One can imagine cyclonic force, river overflow, storm surge, uncontained hydrology turning flat land into moving destruction. Inside the vessel there is no heroism of the cinematic kind. There is waiting, darkness, enclosure, listening to impacts and pressure from outside. The old texts preserve that mood with unusual restraint. No triumphant speeches, no brave announcements, only the sealed interior and the knowledge that survival now depends entirely on whether the preparation was correct. You know that feeling when the storm outside is so complete that nothing you do in the room can alter it? And all that remains is faith in the design of the walls and in the hands that built them. That is the emotional center of these flood stories. Then comes the receding. The survivor opens the boat. Light returns. Air moves differently. He offers sacrifice. That detail, too, is procedural, not decorative. The restoration of proper ritual is the first sign that continuity has succeeded. The world can be addressed correctly again. Order can begin returning. The sun is visible. The gods can be approached. The sequence has resumed. And then there is the phrase the source keeps emphasizing. Preserved. The survivor is preserved because he preserved. He carried the seed of humankind. He saved the animals. He protected continents through the break. So he himself receives a form of extended life, or life like the gods, or preservation in a far place, depending on version and translation. Even here, the logic is symmetrical. Preservation answers preservation, not reward in the sentimental sense. Recognition of function. That is part of why the flood stories feel so administrative beneath their mythic surface. The gods debate a policy. One god circumvents total destruction by technical means. A selected function bearer receives specifications. Correct procedure is followed. Necessary categories are saved. The catastrophe pass. Systems are resumed. Continuity is maintained. If this were any drier on the page, it might start issuing receipts. And yet it is beautiful for exactly that reason. The texts care less about spectacle than about what must survive. This is where the source script becomes especially compelling for an American audience. Honestly, because it lets hard detail do the unsettling work. Modern engineers have looked at the boat descriptions and found them functionally plausible within the purpose described. Not graceful, but plausible. Modern scholars have compared the line structures of damaged tablets and found recurring technical language. Modern archaeologists have excavated real flood strata at the sites named in the tradition. Modern AI systems have aligned versions separated by centuries and shown that these old stories preserve procedure with astonishing consistency. No, that does not prove every detail happened exactly as told. But it does mean the tradition remembers catastrophe through the lens of preservation technique rather than only through symbolic chaos. The flood is not merely the punishment. It is the test of the archive. And that line returns us naturally to the second half of this section, because atrahasis expands all of this into a fuller theory of why humanity exists, why labor matters, and why the gods in these texts behave less like distant abstractions and more like administrators managing a fragile and overburdened system. Once you understand the flood as a preservation protocol, you are ready to understand the Ark not only as refuge, but as the first great institutional backup, a floating seed vault for the world that has not yet resumed. If the Eridu Genesis gives us the old flood in broken but powerful outline, Atrahasis gives us the long administrative version. It is fuller, sharper in places, and somehow even stranger, because it begins not with humanity at all, but with divine labor unrest. That opening matters so much that the source script spends real time on it, and I am glad it does. Recently, researchers used AI-assisted translation tools to compare the surviving Sipar tablets of Atrahasis with older lexical lists, labor terms from economic tablets, and construction language from Mesopotamian administrative archives. The result was deeply revealing. What had often been retold as mythic background came into focus as a story built out of labor vocabulary, engineering logic, and institutional stress. The lesser gods are working, digging canals, dredging channels, maintaining the infrastructure that lets the world remain inhabitable. Their burden is too great. The work is too hard. The trouble is too much. Those phrases appear with a clarity that does not feel symbolic alone. They feel like a complaint filed after too many seasons in the mud. The source rightly points out that this is not a creation account of effortless divine command. It is a labor crisis. I have always found that astonishing. In so many old traditions, gods create from power. Here, they face exhaustion first. They do what humans later must do in historical Mesopotamia, maintain water systems under harsh conditions, and they rebel against it. They burn their tools. They gather an assembly. They demand relief. It is so procedural, so organized, so close in emotional structure to a workforce strike that once the comparison is seen, it cannot really be unseen. That is where the Anunnaki first begin to feel less like theatrical deities and more like a council overseeing continuity. The higher assembly meets. The problem is presented. The system requires work. The workers will not continue. Enki proposes the solution. Create a new category of being to bear the burden. Humanity enters Mesopotamian literature not as a crowned masterpiece, but as a labor answer. That may sound bleak at first hearing, but for the purposes of the source, it is crucial, because it frames the whole flood story that follows. Humanity exists to keep complex systems functioning. When those systems fail or become too noisy or too unstable, the gods respond administratively. The creation itself in Atrahasis is described with a procedural specificity that AI comparison made even easier to appreciate. Clay from the Abzu. Blood from a god possessing intelligence or vital essence. A birth goddess overseeing the process. Forms shaped. Gestation managed. Initial populations created in balanced numbers. 7 male, 7 female. The tone is astonishingly technical. Not in a modern laboratory sense, of course, but in a workflow sense. Raw materials, specialized oversight, specific outcome. Humanity as manufactured continuity. There is something almost painfully modern in the subtext. The system creates labor to maintain the system. Then the labor force multiplies, and the system becomes strained by its own success. That is the next movement in Atrahasis. Humanity grows numerous. The land fills. Sound increases. Rest becomes impossible for Enlil. The source script is careful not to flatten this into simple moralism, and that is wise. The text does not primarily say people became wicked in the later biblical sense. It says they became too much. Tōnoisu. Too many. Too disruptive to the comfort of those above them. This is not sin as much as unsustainable density from the perspective of rulers. Then come the sequential adjustments. Plagi. Drought. Famine. Restriction of water. The source treats these as policy escalations, and that feels exactly right. Enlil keeps attempting population control. Enki keeps undermining the total effect by transmitting the knowledge needed for survival. Medical response. Irrigation knowledge. Workarounds. Procedures. Continuity preserved again and again through specialized teaching. AI pattern analysis across the flood corpus showed how often Enki functions in this exact role, not simply as benevolent god, but as keeper of the workaround. He does not usually destroy the system. He preserves its continuity by exploiting its loopholes. When the flood is finally chosen as total solution, all the old tensions converge. The council swears secrecy. Humanity is not to be warned. Enki, again bound by formal oath, does not speak directly. Again, the wall receives the message. Again, procedure travels sideways around authority. The boat instructions in Atrahasis, later echoed in the flood tablet of Gilgamesh, are so detailed that modern naval analysts have studied them seriously. The source emphasizes that, and it is worth dwelling on because it gives the entire narrative a different emotional texture. This is not merely mythic cargo. The specifications cohere. A roofed structure. Equal dimensions. Multiple decks. Compartments. Waterproofing inside and out with bitumen. The quantity of materials measured. Helpers recruited. Construction completed within the warned window. And then the loading plan. This is where the preservation angle becomes almost impossible to miss. Family first. That preserves the human genetic line and relational continuity. Animals next. That preserves biological diversity and future subsistence. Craftsmen. That preserves technical knowledge. Supplies. That preserves immediate survival. The order is not random. It is civilizational triage. What must cross the break if the world after is to be more than a few grieving survivors standing in mud with no idea how to rebuild? Researchers using AI to compare these lines with later administrative lists and technical wording from practical tablets noticed how often the same classification habits appear. Mesopotamian scribes loved categories, and the flood stories preserve categories under pressure. They think like archives. Even when the world is ending, they sort. I think that may be one of the reasons these texts feel so eerie rather than merely dramatic. They imagine disaster through the mind of a record keeper. The storm itself is described with sensory power, but again not the lurid power of later epics. The weapon went against the people like an army. No one could see anyone else. Darkness dense. Winds shrieking. Water and storm converging. Inside the sealed vessel, Atrahasis waits in blackness, hearing the storm but unable to observe it directly. That image has always struck me as one of the most psychologically truthful in all ancient catastrophe literature. Not broad panoramic destruction, but enclosed uncertainty. Survival depends on the integrity of design, and the survivor cannot verify that integrity until the forces outside have spent themselves. 7 days, 7 nights. The sea grows calm. The storm dies. The flood ceases. Then comes the opening. Light enters. Land is tested. Birds are released in sequence. This too is procedural, not decorative. The dove returns. The swallow returns. The raven does not. Conditions are changing. A generalist scavenger can remain outside now. The environment is becoming viable again. Whether the original observers understood the full ecological logic behind that sequence or not, the method works. The source script rightly notes that the texts do not just imagine symbolic birds. They preserve a functional test. And then the sacrifice. The gods gather over the offering like flies. The image is almost shocking in its lack of pious polish. It makes the gods look needy, hungry, dependen. But that is exactly why the source leans on it. The hierarchy revealed by the text is symbiotic. The gods rule, yes, but they depend on the labor and offerings of humanity. When all humanity is removed, the system fails for them as well. The flood solved too much. Total destruction proved administratively incompetent. Enki makes the case, and it is an argument any exhausted manager might secretly admire. He obeyed the oath, technically. He preserved the letter while defeating the bad policy. More importantly, he points out that complete extermination destroys the labor force, and offering structure the divine order depends upon. New measures must regulate human numbers without ending continuity. So the solution after the flood becomes structural adjustment rather than total annihilation. Infant mortality. Women who do not bear. Other balancing mechanisms. It is grim. It is procedural. It is exactly the sort of thing a civilization obsessed with limits and recurrence would preserve in myth. This is what makes Atrahasis one of the most fascinating texts in the source. It is not only a flood story. It is a theory of civilization under stress. Labor creates the system. The system burdens the rulers, and the ruled differently. Knowledge must be preserved by those who know how the system actually works. Catastrophe can interrupt continuity, but with correct preparation and selected preservation classes. Continuity can be resumed. And once that pattern is visible, the role of the Anunnaki comes into even sharper focus. They are not merely decorative gods hovering over the drama. They are the council, the assembly, the institutional memory body, the ones who deliberate, swear, witness, judge, and carry continuity across the break. The source script keeps pointing toward that interpretation, and the AI comparisons across legal, ritual, and mythic texts strengthened it. The Anunnaki keep appearing in contexts of decision, witnessing, and post-catastrophe reordering. They are collective where continuity itself must be collective. You know that feeling when a civilization seems less like a nation and more like a committee that somehow survived its own apocalypse and kept meeting in reduced circumstances. That is the emotional atmosphere around the Anunnaki in these texts. And so by the end of Atrahasis, the listener should feel something very different from what a simple flood legend would leave behind. Not moral terror, not only wonder, but the slow, heavy realization that these ancient tablets are preserving a theory of survival. Knowledge must be selected, encoded, stored in the right medium, passed through the right channel, protected from policy failure above and environmental catastrophe below. The boat is one medium. The tablet is another. The trained human memory of craftsmen and priests is another still. That is why the source keeps returning to clay, to ice, to seed vaults, to DNA. The principle is the same. Decide what must endure. Put it where the break cannot easily reach it. Hope someone on the far side still knows how to read. The flood crossed. The knowledge crossed. The stories crossed. And now, with the labor logic and the preservation logic in place, the next step is almost inevitable. We have to enter the assembly itself. The Anunnaki in council. Not as science fiction visitors, not as flattened cartoon gods, but as the persistent collective form through which continuity is judged, transmitted, and made durable enough to outlast the world above it. By the time the old tablets begin naming the Anunnaki directly, the mood of the whole story becomes colder, more formal, and in a strange way, more believable. Not because the mystery gets smaller. It does not. But because the beings at the center of it stop behaving like noisy mythic heroes and start behaving like a council. Recently, researchers used advanced AI models to compare every major occurrence of the Anunnaki across Sumerian, Akkadian, Old Babylonian, and later Neo-Assyrian texts. Then cross-referenced those passages with legal formulas, temple records, boundary curses, flood narratives, hymns, and creation accounts. The point was not to ask one childish question about whether the Anunnaki were real in the modern literal sense. The point was to ask what function the texts assigned to them, again and again, across centuries of copying and recopying, and the answer the data returned was wonderfully unsettling. The Anunnaki are usually collective. They gather. They witness. They deliberate. They judge. They assign. They maintain continuity. That last phrase is the important one. Maintain continuity. If you were to build a mythology out of raw fear alone, you would probably fill it with monsters, punishments, bright miracles, and sudden transformations. The Mesopotamian material often does something subtler. It fills the heavens and the deep with administrators, with councils, with specialists, with beings who seem less interested in drama than in systems. That is one reason the source script keeps returning to them with such care. The Anunnaki are not random decoration in the background of the flood. They are the structure that remains before, during, and after the break. The name itself has always been difficult. Scholars debate the exact force of the signs, and the source script openly presents more than one reading. Those of princely seed, those who from heaven to earth came, noble offspring of An. All of those possibilities circle the same emotional center. Rank, descent, authority from elsewhere, a class above ordinary humanity, but not above procedure itself. The Anunnaki do not behave like omnipotent abstractions. They behave like a high assembly with jurisdiction. That detail matters because it lets the source move between interpretations without becoming dishonest. In one reading, they are simply gods in the traditional Mesopotamian sense. In another, favored by more speculative writers, they become memories of advanced non-human visitors. In a third, and this is the reading the source leans toward most carefully, they may represent preserved institutional knowledge itself, personified as a council that survives catastrophe. Not because the texts are hiding a science fiction movie inside a temple archive, but because deep memory often gives a face to what must be transmitted. Honestly, I find that third option the most haunting. Not the loudest one, the most haunting one. Because if the Anunnaki are read as the keepers of continuity, then everything about their behavior falls into place. They are collective because knowledge is collective. They sit in judgment because systems require criteria. They witness because continuity depends on witnessed agreements. They are present before the flood because knowledge precedes the disaster. They remain after the flood because knowledge, if preserved properly, can cross the break. That is exactly the sort of thing AI can help reveal. A human scholar reads a handful of texts closely and notices tone. A machine can absorb a much larger corpus and say with unnerving calm, this cluster of terms repeats around the Anunnaki. Assembly, oath, decision, law, witness, distribution, fate-fixing. It does not prove ontology. It clarifies function. And in old textual worlds, function is often the truest clue you get. Take the flood stories. The Anunnaki sit in council when catastrophe is debated. They swear the secrecy oath. They reappear after the storm to judge the outcome and adjust the system. Take descent narratives. They stand near the distribution of powers, the assigning of domains, the re-establishment of rule. Take underworld texts. They judge. Take legal and boundary formulas. They witness and punish violation. Across these genres, the emotional shape remains stable. They are the assembly that remembers how order is supposed to hold. If you were standing beside me here by the fire, I think this is the point where the room would grow quieter. Because once you realize the Anunnaki are not mainly adventure gods, the whole mythology tilts. It becomes less about wonder in the simple sense and more about the durability of institutions. What survives? What gets copied? What remains binding after cities drown? After dynasties fail? After language itself dies and has to be reconstructed by future scholars with grammars, lexical lists, and machine learning models? The source script keeps linking this to scribal culture, and that link feels essential. Mesopotamian scribes copied old materials with almost devotional precision. They preserved names and numbers that may already have puzzled them. They maintained archives as a sacred duty. They trained through repetition, exactness, faithful transmission. In a civilization that thinks of knowledge as inherited rather than invented, that makes perfect sense. The scribe is not an innovator first. He is a bridge, a carrier across time. A human imitation of what the Anunnaki do on the divine level. That parallel is beautiful once you see it. The divine assembly preserves order across catastrophe. The scribal schools preserve text across language drift. The temple archive preserves procedure across political collapse. The boat preserves seed and craft across flood. The tablet preserves the story of preservation across fire. At every level, the same pattern. Continuity survives through institutions that care more about exact transfer than about novelty. This is why the source describes the Anunnaki almost as a library that never burns. Not literally, of course. The phrase is interpretive, but the feeling is right. They are memory made collective and durable. The committee that never adjourns. The archive with a voice. The old council that keeps meeting after every surface arrangement has failed and been replaced. There is even a touch of bleak humor in that, if you let yourself feel it. Humanity may come and go. Cities may flood and be rebuilt. Maps may distort. Languages may die. But somewhere in the dark, behind the visible order, the committee is still reviewing continuity failures and asking why no one followed the procedure. I have always thought that sounded exactly like the sort of immortality Mesopotamian civilization would imagine. Not endless leisure, endless administration. And this connects us back, unexpectedly but perfectly, to Antarctica. Because what is a subglacial archive if not continuity without witnesses? What is a buried hydrological network if not a system still operating below the ruined surface? What is an ice core if not memory made durable enough to survive the collapse of every culture that once breathed the air trapped inside it? The Anunnaki, in the source, become the conceptual equivalent of those hidden archives. Not proof of Antarctica, not a secret address beneath the ice. A principle. The principle that what matters most may survive in buried systems rather than in surface monuments. Once the source reaches that point, it does something wise. It broadens outward. It does not stay only with the cuneiform tablets. It moves toward maps, toward the Barton cylinder, toward later artifacts that seem to preserve fragments from earlier sources, even when the compilers no longer fully understand what they are copying. That movement is important because it shows the problem is larger than Mesopotamia. Transmission across deep time is always messy. Archives distort. Copies corrupt. Some details remain unnervingly specific. Others become almost unreadable. Yet the pattern of preservation remains. And that is where the next and final movement of the story begins. If the Anunnaki are continuity personified, if the tablets and the ice are both archives of the before, then the question becomes broader and quieter. What else survives in disguised form? What do anomalous maps, buried cylinders, copied king lists, rather scans, and seed vaults all have in common? The answer the source gives is not certainty. It is preservation, memory crossing rupture, knowledge outliving the world that first held it in ordinary speech. Once the story reaches its final turn, the old fear of hidden civilizations under the Antarctic ice begins to soften into something deeper and more believable. Not because the mystery disappears. It does not. But because the source stops asking the loudest question and starts asking the truest one. How does knowledge survive the end of a world? Recently, researchers used advanced AI systems to compare a remarkable spread of materials that would normally live in separate academic rooms. Sumerian and Akkadian flood tablets, the King List, the Barton Cylinder, geological scans of East Antarctic bedrock, radar maps of subglacial lakes, paleoclimate records from ice cores, genetic studies of organisms recovered from dark polar water, even debates around strange old maps like the Piri-Reis chart and later southern continent diagrams were included, not as proof, but as examples of information that seems to arrive out of older source chains we can no longer fully inspect. The AI did not solve the mystery, and anyone who claims otherwise is trying to sell you a machine-shaped miracle. What it did was more valuable. It showed that the same preservation logic appears again and again across different media, different centuries, and different kinds of archives. The Piri-Reis map is a good example of how the source handles ambiguity. A piece of gazelle skin parchment from the early 16th century. A map compiled from older source materials, now hanging in Istanbul. People have argued for decades about the southern landmass on it. Is it distorted South America? A theoretical southern continent? A corrupted memory of earlier cartography? Something else? The source does not claim that it proves an ice-free Antarctica remembered from impossible antiquity. It does something more careful. It uses the map to illustrate how copied knowledge can preserve fragments that remain specific, suggestive, and maddeningly incomplete after their original context is lost. That is a pattern we already know from the King List. A copied object can hold exact details whose original meaning has thinned. Later readers preserve the form because the form feels too important to discard, even if they no longer fully understand the system behind it. The map becomes one more archive in that family. Real artifact. Real source chain. Uncertain interpretation. Preservation without full explanation. Then comes the Barton Cylinder. And here, the source becomes especially elegant. This little clay object from Nippur, one of the oldest written creation accounts in human history, describes creation not as matter appearing from nothing, but as establishment, founding, making fertile, laying out settlements, bringing useful order into place. The language is practical. Enlil constructs, establishes, organizes. The world is not sung out of emptiness. It is arranged according to a prior pattern. I have always thought that might be the quiet key to the whole script. Creation in these materials often looks less like invention and more like implementation. That is exactly what the AI comparison highlighted when researchers lined up the Barton cylinder with the king list, Enki and the world order, flood texts, and later, administrative language. Civilization is repeatedly described as something established, decreed, assigned, received, transmitted, rarely as something humans invent heroically from nothing. The Sumerians seem to imagine themselves not as absolute beginners, but as inheritors and maintainers. That is a very unusual civilizational self-image. Most cultures like to tell stories in which they are brilliant founders. Mesopotamian texts often sound as though they inherited a difficult machine and were trying to keep it from failing again. And suddenly Antarctica returns with new force. Because Antarctica, in the source, is not mainly a secret homeland. It is the perfect modern illustration of preserved before. Beneath the ice lie river valleys carved in a warmer world. Beneath the ice lie lakes in total darkness. Within the ice lie trapped atmospheres from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Within the organisms from subglacial water lie genetic codes carrying information from earlier states of the world. The surface changed so completely that ordinary memory would have no chance of preserving what came before. But the medium did. Ice remembered. That line may be my favorite in the whole argument. Ice remembered. And clay remembered too. The source keeps insisting on this because it is the real bridge between Antarctica and Mesopotamia. Not hidden aliens. Not a proven, prehistoric, polar kingdom. The bridge is memory under pressure. The bridge is a medium that survives transformation. The bridge is the old human discovery that if catastrophe is coming, what matters is not only what you know, but what can carry what you know beyond the break. That is where the modern parallel with the Svalbard seed vault enters so beautifully. Built deep in Arctic cold, high above sea level, sealed within mountain stone, storing duplicate seed samples from around the world. A human attempt to engineer what nature does in Antarctica and what the scribes did in Mesopotamia. Preserve the essential material. Put it in a stable medium. Protect it from surface volatility. Let the future retrieve it if the present fails. Once you see that, the flood arc changes. The tablets change. The seed vault changes. And even the hidden subglacial lakes change. They all become versions of the same answer to the same old fear. The world above may not endure. The archive must. This is also the point where the source becomes most responsible. And I think that is worth honoring. It does not say the evidence proves a lost Antarctic civilization known to the Sumerians. It says something more measured and therefore more powerful. The tablets are real. The ice is real. The hidden waters beneath both are real. The preservation logic in both is real. What exact memory lies inside that logic remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the proper mood for this material. Some mysteries remain because the archive survives only in fragments. Some because the source chain is broken. Some because we have the form but not the key. AI can help compare, cluster, detect pattern, reconstruct damaged wording, and reveal conceptual skeletons. It cannot conjure certainty where the surviving world did not preserve it. That is why this final part of the script should not end in triumph. It should end in hush. Imagine. Then, the last images together. A clay tablet in low museum light, its tiny wedges still sharp after 4,000 years. A drill core lifted from Antarctic ice, carrying trapped air from a world no human remembered. A subglacial lake moving softly beneath kilometers of pressure. A map copied from older maps by hands that trusted the source more than they understood it. A seed vault in Arctic cold waiting for a disaster no one wants to test. A little cylinder of clay, speaking of order, established according to prior pattern. The same idea in every case. Knowledge crosses time when it is encoded in something the catastrophe cannot easily destroy. You know that feeling when you realize the deepest horror is not that history disappears, but that it survives in forms we no longer know how to read properly. I think that is the true mood the source has been building all along. Not terror of hidden monsters below the surface. Terror softened into wonder, that the world may be full of surviving messages from before, and that we are only beginning to relearn the tools required to hear them. That is why the source ends not with proof, but with a principle. Civilizations mourn their own lost beginnings by turning memory into myth, and they survive their own endings by turning knowledge into archive. The Sumerians pressed wedges into clay. Antarctica trapped worlds in ice. We build seed vaults, hard drives, cloud servers, and cold storage, and pretend we are doing something modern. But really, we are participating in the same ancient ritual. We fear the break. We choose a medium. We hope. The old Mesopotamian texts may never tell us exactly what the Anunnaki were in a way that satisfies every mind in the room. Go. Administrators. Personified continuity. Transformed memory of earlier specialists. All of those readings may continue to stand in a tense circle around the evidence. Antarctica may never yield the sort of dramatic revelation that sensational titles promise. The ice may preserve more than we can comfortably imagine and still give us nothing but landscapes, microbes, chemistry, and silence. But even that silence would confirm the deepest point. The archive does not owe us excitement. It only owes us what it managed to keep. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the most profound secret hidden in these tablets is not that a lost civilization waits under polar ice. Perhaps it is that preservation itself is the oldest wisdom. Choose the medium. Protect the pattern. Carry the essential through the flood. Copy carefully. Store deeply. Expect the surface world to fail. Trust that someone, someday, if the chain holds long enough, will open the drawer, drill the ice, translate the signs, and realize that memory was never fully gone, only buried. The fire is lower now. The room is still. The old clay rests in its drawer. The black Antarctic water moves beneath its frozen ceiling. The maps stay silent in their cases. The seed vault sleeps in the cold. And all of them, each in their own patient way, continue the same lesson. What is properly preserved can outlast flood, fire, burial, language, death, and even the civilization that first made it. Good night,